Now, this was an organisation within the then Department of Education, Employment and Training, and it had a board which supervised it, and that board was made up of representatives from various education sectors, from universities, from vocational training institutes, from state governments, from the English language sector, from the school sector. We also paid IDP a sum of money and claimed back the Australian Education Centre network and made it part of this organisation. The AECs, in essence, were there to provide advice to students interested in studying in Australia. And they were a very necessary part of our framework at that stage, because the networks of education agents, which we see all over the world now, really did not exist back in those days. This was an improvement on our earlier arrangements, but what we found was that the board created far more problems than it solved. Whilst it gave the industry a voice in setting education policy, none of the board members could see beyond the interests of the constituency they represented to see the bigger picture. And it's a risk you always get with a representative board. We had a change of government in 1996. The Howard government was elected, and like most new governments, wanted to characterise all these type of agencies with their own imprint, and so they had a review of the AIEF and abolished it and replaced it with AEI, which is the organisation we now have today. AEI was pretty much exactly the same as AIEF, except it didn't have a board and it belonged to the new government, not the old government. Whether by accident or design, the combination of the new AEI, the new role that IDP had, which was purely as an agent in this area, and the networks of relationships we built up at government level and with education agents in other countries, seemed to be a very good approach, which has been very successful for Australia over the last 10 to 15 years. But what were the key success factors that made this work? Number one was that AEI was situated within the Department of State, which was responsible for education. A lot of arguments were put forward that it should be within the trade portfolio, or that it should be situated with our cultural promotion within the foreign affairs portfolio. Neither of these would have been as effective as having it as part of the education portfolio. It allowed people like me who were working offshore, it meant that I had an education background. It meant that I could talk to ministries of education in other countries, speak the same language as them. I understood how universities worked. I'd worked in universities. If we'd put AEI within a trade portfolio, you'd have got trade experts talking about education as if it was a commodity like nuts and bolts, which would not have gone down well with our education counterparts in Asia or anywhere else in the world. It also meant that it was much easier for us to take a whole-of-government approach to international education. And I'll talk about this later on, but it's probably the single most important thing. The links across the various government portfolios, trade, immigration, foreign affairs, tourism, science and innovation, the links that we could make were what made this successful. If you don't get your migration and your visa settings right, if you don't get the links between education and tourism and make sure you're not getting conflicting promotional messages, you're going to cause yourself all sorts of problems. Second thing, I think, was the passage of the Education Services for Overseas Students Act. Australia is still the only country in the world which has an Act of Parliament specifically passed to protect the rights of international students. It protects them financially in terms of making sure that they get a refund if their college should close down and be unable to provide the services they paid for. And it imposes a whole regulatory structure on the industry to ensure that the quality of the education, both the education services and the support services that the students are receiving meets necessary standards. And I should emphasise that it isn't just the academic, it is those support services that make a huge difference to the way your education system is perceived in the market. And the third thing was a strong relationship between government and industry. We tried initially to do that through a representative board. That wasn't the right way, but we have found other mechanisms, which I don't have time to go into here, where we do maintain a very strong and positive relationship between AEI and the peak bodies that represent the universities or our TAFEs or our private colleges or our schools or our English language colleges. And if there were three things I'd point to as being important, those would be the three. So what is AEI? Very quickly, the national office is situated within our Department of what is now called Education, Employment and Workplace Relations. I don't know if it happens in Hong Kong, but every 3 years we reorganise our government departments, and they have a different name from which is one of the reasons we've stuck with AEI as being because that remains constant despite the Department of Education being co-situated with other different portfolios within government changing every 2 or 3 years. The best one from my perspective was when we were the Department of Education, Science and Training, because the science link with education is crucial in terms of promoting a promotion of excellence in research overseas. AEI is about 200 employees in Canberra, and overseas we have 25 offices. 15 of those are run by outposted officers such as myself, and we have over 100 locally employed staff around the world. Why are there so many people in Canberra? That's because AEI has three key objectives. One is the simple promotion of Australia as a destination for international students. The second is the management of relationships with foreign governments around education. And the third one is the regulation of the providers of the industry. And this third function has been, ever since it was first incorporated with the other two, a subject of some debate. And there are regularly suggestions that it's inappropriate to have the regulator and the promoter situated in the same agency. And that debate's been revived in the recent Bradley Review of Higher Education. The offshore offices have a much simpler job: government-to-government relationships and promotion of education. In Hong Kong, we have an office here in the Australian Consulate General, run by Heidi, who's sitting there, and we also have offices in China, in Beijing, Shanghai and Guangzhou. Those four offices comprise the AEI China operation, which I run, and altogether there are about 20 of us involved in that. For AEI, or for Australia, China is the single most important market, not including Hong Kong and Taiwan. 1/4 of our students come from China. Okay, one of the things that we decided early was that we needed a national brand. We weren't like the UK and the US, which had this long history of prestigious universities which would automatically attract students. Education has now become Australia's third largest export earner and the largest services export earner. And for Victoria, our second most populous state, it is the single biggest export industry. We're now the third most popular English-speaking destination after the UK and the USA, and the fifth most important destination for all students. The other two that are ahead of us are both European countries, which count intra-European students as being international students, which to some extent they are and to some extent they're not. From Hong Kong, for example, more students have chosen to pursue higher education studies in Australia in the last few years than in any other country, including the US and the UK. It would have been, but competition has been strong and it's increasing more now than ever. And a brand which identifies you and gives students and allows you to continually deliver the same consistent message is a very important tool. Australia introduced the Study in Australia brand with the kangaroo with its leg through the words back in 2002 after 2 years of market research and consultations with our providers. We identified the key elements that set Australian education apart from other countries and also the key messages that resonated in key markets. The brand was refreshed in 2007, and I think that consisted of changing the colour of the leg of the kangaroo. And then in response to the recent global economic downturn, it's been reinvented as the Study in Australia 2010 brand, which is the one you see in the corner of all the slides. But our brand has been consistent ever since it was first put in place, and we've stuck with the same messages throughout this period, something which contrasts very strongly with our competitors. For example, the British Council has a new brand every year and a new key and a new little logo, and we've found that sticking with the same brand has been far more effective.